Throughout history, land has been a source of power, identity, and survival for Black communities. After centuries of ecological cultivation and agricultural innovation, our ancestors brought valuable knowledge of the land to the harsh wilderness of the Americas. And they and their knowledge built the United States from the ground up. But from the broken promise of 40 acres and a mule to the oppressive system of sharecropping, and now the rising tide of gentrification, many of us still don't have land to call our own. I don't know about y'all, but I think it's about time we talk about reparations. Land reparations. I'm Darren from PushBlack, and you're listening to Black History Year. You know, in many circles, it's said that owning land is the key to wealth and freedom, but I want to challenge that idea. Is true liberation even possible in a system that commodifies land and pushes out the most vulnerable? A system that's currently criminalizing houselessness after creating the conditions for it. Psst. To explore this and much, much more, we brought in someone deeply entrenched in the trenches of this work, the incredible Brea Baker. Brea is a freedom fighter and writer who's been on the front lines for almost a decade. She just released her debut book, Rooted: The American Legacy of Land Theft and the Modern Movement for Black Land Ownership. Now, in it, she digs into the history of one of America's original and ongoing sins, land theft. Get ready for an eye opening episode that'll shine a light on the historical roots of today's housing crisis and maybe help you finally get that 40 acres and a mule. Stay tuned.
What's up, fam? Before we dive into the episode, I have one small favor to ask. Please spread the word about Black History Year on social media. Podcasting is competitive, y'all, and the best way to grow is through your promotion. You can shout out this episode or share one lesson from it you found super interesting. Just tag us at We Are Push Black on Instagram and TikTok so more folks can access the Black history they didn't teach us in school. Your support means the world to us, and your minute of effort makes our hours of work worth it. So thank you, fam. Yo, Brea, I'm super curious. Is this your first text that you published, Rudy?
The first one that I've published, like a full one under my own name, yes. I have contributed to anthologies before, and I've done a little ghostwriting. That's another story. But yeah, it's the first full project under my own name.
Wow. That's such an amazing feat. So we should champion that from the beginning. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you.
I'm curious though, because you're like on a bit of a promo tour right now, right? You're in DC.
Yeah. Yes, and it's just kicking off, so I feel like I'm still in that infant energy of it. Yesterday was our launch in New York. Today I'm in DC right now. We're going to be at Busboys and Poets. So it's been a whirlwind already, but I have 10 more cities to go. So I'm just trying to lean in, and I'm just hyped because, there was a time very recently where we didn't really know what in-person book promotion would look like. And I'm grateful to be able to connect to people in person. It really does change the energy.
Yes, indeed. I'm super curious as well about just the different receptions to the text, depending on what organizations you're engaging with, who you're in conversation with. Let me just be explicit. I'm curious how white people receive your text, like other folks.
I love that you just said that. Yeah. No, definitely. I feel like when I talk to Black people about this topic, even if I'm not explicitly talking about the book, what typically happens is they're like, oh, my family also used to own land in this part of the South, or we still do, or I do family reunions down South, or that reminds me of this part of my history. So it's always oh, me too. Right. Which I love. And that's what made me write the book. Was if I thought my family was the only one and we were unicorns, that wouldn't have felt as special to me. But it was the fact that we all have this story, and yet the mainstream racial justice conversation isn't including that, isn't meaningfully addressing the needs that come from that sort of harm. So that's the conversation that happens with Black audiences. And then as far as white folks, I think it's a mixed bag. I think there are some really dope young white people who are thinking more critically, especially, as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement, about racial equity and justice and things of that nature. And when they hear about it, it just is widening their eyes to what that looks like. And again, this is partly because the way that, white mainstream media heads talk about Black people, you'd think we only live in cities. We only live in cities in the North and the West, like Oakland and LA and New York and Detroit and Chicago. But more than 50% of Black Americans still live in the South. And most of us have come through the South. So even if we're not living in the South, we have some sort of tie and investment in what's happening there. And that just is not being connected. So it's more just like whoa, I didn't realize this was such a pervasive conversation. And thank you so much. It helps me think about reparations in a different way, which really shows me that that's why they're banning these sorts of books and this sort of content and curriculum, because when people are exposed, they want to do more.
One quick follow-up question on this, Brea. I'm curious, how have indigenous persons and communities kind of received your text and the work that you're doing as well?
Yeah, that was a always a really sensitive place for me. And I know not everyone is, but for me, multiracial solidarity matters a lot. I'm a very pro-Black person, but that doesn't mean that I'm not considerate of the fact that we do have similar and shared histories to other people. And for me, it never felt like, I mean, I knew that there was a tension to an extent, but it's more the tension at the hands of white supremacy. And I always wanted to keep the tension there. And instead of it being like a Black versus indigenous, to me it was sort of like Black reparations necessitates land back. Because how do we have a conversation about slavery and land theft and not talk about indigenous Americans, and vice versa? You can't talk about land theft and not talk about the people that they were using to work the land they just stole. So to me, it was like, if we have the real conversation, we'll be zooming out enough to talk about both of our groups. And I tried to seed that in the book a lot. I actually haven't gotten to hear directly from a lot of indigenous folks who have already read it. But I have talked to a lot of indigenous and Afro-Indigenous folks throughout the process of the book. And I felt like there was a lot of real willingness to be a part of that conversation. And most of the indigenous people that I were talking to were already really invested in reparations and racial equity work. So for Black people in particular. And then there being this sort of tandem, let's work together because we've also got this land back movement over here. I think the tension comes in when we talk about execution, of course, and who gets what acre exactly. But to me, we're still on the, can we commit to doing it? And then let's wrestle with and iron out the wrinkles together. But we've got to actually get to a place where reparations is a implemented policy, not just a let's study it through a task force.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Thank you so much for all that richness.
Yeah,
It just makes me think about how essential land and our relationship with land is to the concept and notion of Black liberation writ large. And with that said,
completely.
yeah, I'm curious though, at a very broad, high level, Brea, from your perspective, what does Black liberation look like to you?
I love this question. Okay. I feel like with any question like this, I often try to get very grounded because it's easy to say things that are very ethereal. Like, what does that really mean, though? Black liberation is, and it's like, okay, but outside of the poetry of it, which
Mm,
I love the craft of putting words together, but like, actually, what is it? And when I think of what my ancestors' wildest dream was, I think that they thought of rest,
mm,
work being on their own time, not under the lash, but working hard because they know what that hard labor will produce for them and their families. Being able to raise children and know that you can provide them safety, provide them joy, provide them opportunity, knowing that the assets that you acquire in your lifetime are things you'll be able to pass on to them, and not only liquid assets or property in that more like economic sense, but also the assets and the values that are not going to be taken advantage of and ripped from them. And that's where, the antithesis of that is everything that has happened to our ancestors. Like, we're working towards repairing everything that happened to them because what they had was forced labor, no
mm,
rest, no ability to control the life for you or your children. Your children can be ripped from you, anything can be done to them, and you can't really defend or protect them. And land became this sort of um, like projection and this material sense of, oh, with land, I can grow something of my own. I can raise my kids out of the sight of people who may want to do harm to them. And I can provide an enclave and a shelter and an oasis for them that is outside of the realm of what this like white supremacy society believes is possible for them. So
mm.
yeah, I think liberation is just not having to be in resistance all the time, just getting to exist and be happy and raise kids knowing that that's going to be their birthright too.
Oh, I love that so much. I was going to follow up with a very simple, poetic kind of comment to try to sum it up. What I'm hearing is that, yeah, we need a space to be, right? To just
Yeah.
be free in our fullness beyond the gaze and the confines of just this hegemonic system that we're moving through,
Yes.
not being coerced into forced labor. And actually, this was a very rich point that you bring up in your text to get us started. I would love to read this really quickly.
Yeah.
You tell us that some of us, Black folks, have learned to hate anything related to agriculture because of how white people forced it upon our ancestors. Either that or we associate being outdoors with white people stuff. With that said, I want to take it back. I want to think about how did our relationship with land change? How did that change on an ideological level? Here at Push Black, we often talk about decoloniality. We recognize
Mm,
the ways in which colonialism, the advent of it, still continues today, right? Not only in just
yeah.
the we're forced to live through institutions, but the ideas we carry in our heads.
Right. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
so, just on a very broad level, yeah, what are some of those kind of colonial ideas that we still kind of hold on to as it relates to land?
For sure. Okay, so the main one is individualism.
Oh,
Black people historically across the diaspora, but especially in the African continent, have always held land and property in general in very communalist ways. It's always the village, the tribe, and everything is really shared, and all of the resources and the surplus goes back to making sure that everyone has. But in American colonialist society and a lot of other European colonies, what they export is this idea of what's mine is mine,
mm,
and kind of what's yours is mine. But this idea of if you can buy something for yourself and put up a big enough wall to protect your family from the outside world, that's the goal, as opposed to having a neighborhood and a community and a village that you trust each other enough to want to share what you have, to want to make sure each other is cared for. And so even in US soil, black people really treated property very differently than white Americans did. We still, like, a lot of the gains that we made in land ownership were all in communal land holdings. It was not a
mm,
billionaire over there doing his thing and saying that that meant that black America was doing well. It was church congregations going in together and buying land because they knew we couldn't do it alone, but together we can pool our money. Emancipation Park in Houston is a product of a Juneteenth celebration where black people got together and said, let's pool our money together and buy this park and leave something for future generations. And they did just that. So this idea now that, oh, I'm really just trying to stack up and stay out the way, or I'm trying to be a billionaire and get out the hood, like that, those are very colonialist white supremacist mindsets, because you're not safe just because you've put up this wall and this gate and this ivory tower around you. You need community to be your safeguard. And we've always done things that always helped the rest of our community. So that's one for sure, is this individualism. But just
yeah.
in general, the idea that, even when we held land and owned property, we didn't try to corral the environment in this really destructive way.
Ah,
And I think that's a very colonialist mindset to be both extractive, but to also try and force the productivity around them, to say the land has to yield more, the
mm,
land has to grow more, because I need to be able to take more. We've always been very symbiotic. I take as much as I give to the land. I don't take more than I need. And we treat the land like a relative. You talk to
oh,
black elders and their love of land is not just economic. It's also spiritual and ancestral. And that's not a whiteness, not white, not every white person, but whiteness sees land as only a commodity, as
yeah.
something to put something else on top of. But we have seen land as something that can grow, something that you sow into and you harvest and you reap from it too.
Oh, we. My goodness, my goodness. Right now, I'm thinking about this very pressing question that you raise in your text, rooted the American legacy of land theft and the modern movement for Black land ownership, where you ask explicitly, why is less than 1% of rural land in the U.S. owned by Black people? Um, Brea, how do we get here? Like, where do we even begin to think about the context, the historical context for where we are today? And that staggering quote: "Less than 1% of rural land owned by Black folks." Yeah,
Yeah.
how do we get here?
Yeah, 1,000,000%. I'm not the only person who has said this, but the main refrain that comes to mind is that this country is happy to have us working the land, but never owning it. We were
Mm,
never brought here to be owners. We were brought here to be property, right? And so, really, this story begins after emancipation because now former property is trying to own property, and white
mm,
America's like, what that it's tripping them out because if I saw you the same way I saw that land and I have dehumanized and all of that, then I don't believe that you can own anything. And certainly not as much as me. And so that's why Reconstruction failed. There was no investment in making sure that we could bear some of that fruit. But again, we had always known that there were different ideas of what liberation could look like after emancipation. Some said, look, we ain't never gonna get free on this land. We gotta go back to the continent. Some
yeah.
said we've been away for a long time. We don't speak the language. It's not our land anymore. There are people still there. And we built this nation. We built its wealth.
Mhm,
I know the Carolina swamps. I know these barrier islands. I know the Delta. And I want freedom right here. And that needed to be acreage and land ownership. But Reconstruction, there was no investment in it. And
mm,
so after failed Reconstruction, you have this period where, despite that, Black land ownership is on this huge rise. And
mm,
by like 1910, 1920, Black people have come to own about 14% of American farmland. Now, that's still not as good as it should be, considering we have worked so many plantations and so many acres of land in this country and sent so many products up north into factories that have made this entire nation very, very wealthy. So we should
mhm,
have more than 14%. But the fact that we could do that and acquire so much with no help from the federal government really was really mind blowing. And when those numbers got that high is when you start seeing things like the Wilmington Massacre, the
mm,
Tulsa Massacre, the Red Summer of 1919, the creation of sundown towns, and this idea of, well, we got to get Black people the F up out of here. And let's also, in the meantime, because we've always needed them as labor, so let's keep those who we can incarcerate and we can force them to work. But we need to find a replacement for this labor source because we don't want a wealthy Black people in the South. So if Black people are going to be fleeing the South as a result of the violence that we are putting out, we need a new labor force. And then
mm,
the labor force becomes machines and technology and the industrialization of agriculture. And now we get to this place where those who do still have farms are being pushed off, not through explicit violence like a riot or a massacre, but they're being pushed out because they can't afford to have a farm anymore. And so
mhm.
now you have, by the Pigford settlement and things of that nature, I'm getting ahead of myself, but by the end of the 20th century, we have less than 1% of Black people owning land when just 90 years before they had more than 14%.
My goodness, my goodness. So you just referenced Tulsa, Wilmington,
Yeah.
and these other incidents of Black land theft. I'm curious, in preparation and your research for the text, did you come across any events that you yourself were not aware of and that you were startled by? Anything to share with us here?
Yeah, 1,000,000,000%. As you said, Tulsa is what we all kind of have in our lexicon. And that was really the only major massacre that I had grown up knowing about. I
Mhm,
had heard of sundown towns. I hadn't put a lot of thought into how one got created. And a
mhm.
lot of sundown towns and counties were started through massacres. Yes.
My God.
So most of like if you research Google whatever the history of any you look up a sundown town and then find out when was the last time the Black people were living there, there's often a moment where and suddenly by the next census that population has dropped to zero. But what happened in between? Oh, there was a massacre. And there were so many of these. So the biggest, I think, the Red Summer of 1919 was a big one for me to
Yeah.
understand. This happened before Tulsa. This was 2 years before Tulsa. And this was just like all year long in towns and counties across the country, there were these large massacres, white mobs just being inspired by each other and
Wow.
and burning down Black neighborhoods, beating and shooting people who were fleeing, just as what happened in Tulsa. And they don't get all of the visibility, but it happened in Chicago. It happened in New York. It also happened all throughout the South. And throughout the South, these events often led to the creation of Sundown Town. So that's a major one. But then also the Wilmington Massacre is the one where I had like briefly heard of it before, but I had not fully understood the scale of the death and how much it inspired other places, like Atlanta's massacre that happened a few years later. So Wilmington was a really alarming one, and that recently came back into more mainstream conversation because Wilmington is the only successful coup on U.S. soil of a U.S. government. Now, there have been many coups of indigenous nations, right? And so that I don't want to invisibilize that history, but once America is established, the only successful coup on American soil was in Wilmington because a biracial legislature was elected and white people in Wilmington couldn't stand it. They exiled at gunpoint different elected officials and lawyers and Black landowners in the city, killed hundreds more, took property, burned deeds, and the Wilmington Massacre became the blueprint for what happens in places like Atlanta and Tulsa.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Take
Yeah.
them all.
Yeah.
Yes. Wow. So right now I'm thinking about, of course, this history of white vigilantism
Yeah.
as it relates to Black land theft and these massacres. But also, don't want to absolve the actual federal government's kind of
Yep.
participation and kind of co-option of these things. I'm curious, did you come across any particular policies, or are there some particular policies that we should be aware of that led to like a systemic theft of land from Black
Yeah.
communities?
Ooh, so many. Okay, I'm going to try not to ramble, but first and foremost, I want to say that in almost every massacre that I have researched, the local and federal government has been either complicit at,
Mm,
at best or a direct part at worst. In Tulsa, this is a major claim that gets made even by the living survivors, was that National Guardsmen and policemen who were paid through taxpayer dollars were part of the violence. So it wasn't just white vigilantes like George Zimmerman types. It was people who are being paid salaries by the government and are engaging in the violence. But even in places like Wilmington, you know, North Carolina governors were part of plotting that violence. U.S. House of Representative members were fundraising and giving speeches and encouraging the violence that happened in 1898 in Wilmington. So it wasn't implicit. And then many of the architects of the massacre who were working with these governors and House of Representatives then became governors and senators and representatives themselves. And they grew on to become very successful. And so you see the sort of networking and brotherhood that happens where you sort of bond and say, hey, you remember we did that massacre back then, you're going to get me into office now. And power is multiplying in that way. But there's also this more insidious sort of violence, as you were talking about, the more policy side of taking Black land too. Eminent domain is a major one, has been used for over a century to take Black land. And eminent domain is a policy that says that the government can appropriate any land for public use, is how eminent domain is supposed to go. And that's supposed to mean that if land is toxic to the public, or if it just needs to be publicly held, it can and will be. So yeah, there's these more insidious ways of the government helping to push people off of their land. One of those is eminent domain, and it's supposed to be this actually public interest sort of policy that says the government can appropriate any land for public use, and that sounds like a good thing. The government can say that we need this land to be a park, so you can't have it for your mansion, or that's what you'd want it to be. But what's actually happening is that they're saying, oh, we need your land to build a highway. And the you is almost always a Black family. It's
Yo,
always, we need your land to build a highway. We need your land to build a park. And so that happens all the time, that eminent domain is used to take Black land. I use that examples of that in the book. There's so many other ways, though, really racist tax codes and assessments that are used, which is very similar to redlining, but would also happen with farms in the South. heirs property laws. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but eminent domain is one of the biggest killers.
Yes, indeed. Okay. For our listeners, I have my mother in the studio with us. Mom, weren't we just talking about this with regards to the Clayborn area in New Orleans? Are you familiar with New Orleans, Brea?
Yeah.
Okay, so like Clayborn still has a very lively, rich Black population and community and culture there. But I didn't know that it was at one time an affluent Black community before they built
Wow.
literally right through it using eminent domain to take that land. And also, while you were speaking about it, it made me think of Seneca Village in New York,
Yes.
Central Park, huge
Yes.
Black neighborhood, affluent Black
Yes.
neighborhood. My goodness. So there's like,
Literally, both of those examples are so spot on because number one, the first example that you said is this affluent communities being targeted. So if you needed to build a highway, the mindset is why not build this highway in the least obstructive way possible? But you're going to build it through a neighborhood that's thriving. There's no blight there. There's no abandoned housing or buildings, but there's so many wide swaths of land where you couldn't have rerouted that. And it never happens to white affluent communities. They never get the landfill put in their backyard, the highway put right in the middle of their city. That doesn't happen to them. Lake Lanier is an example of some similar dynamics, but the Central Park one is one that people are not very aware of, I should say. And then it's especially, I think I really like the Central Park Seneca Village story, which I do include in the book and is also included in Clint Smith's How the Word is Passed, which I really loved. But because people think that the North was this progressive haven and the North was doing what the South was doing too, but the South was where more Black people were. So it was easier to see what was happening in the South because there's such a large mass of Black people there. But the North was doing the same. And Seneca Village was a very diverse, actually multiracial Black, Irish, and indigenous community. And the New York Times was very, very implicit in helping to spread really racist tropes about Seneca Village residents raping white people and there being these brutes there. And why do they have this property right in the middle of the city? And it starts to build this public pressure for, hey, let's take their land. And then these policies like eminent domain are just perfectly positioned so the politicians can say, oh, well, this is actually really popular for me to use eminent domain to do because my residents are already hating the residents over there. And so I can leverage their hatred to use this. But eminent domain is not always used in the, oh, let's create a park. Nowadays, the government can say, we need your land and take it through eminent domain and then sell it to a private developer. And as long as there's a small percentage of affordable housing or a small percentage of commercial property that's going to be there, that's enough public interest for the land for that to be enough. So you see Black families losing their land so that a developer can get millions back in kickback, so a politician can get millions in kickbacks, so a developer can get new prime real estate in a neighborhood that's on transition. That happens a lot in places like New York and the Bay and LA.
My goodness. Just to put a cap on these policies, thank you so much for just detailing that history of eminent domain for us. You also mentioned redlining.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could just provide just a brief overview of what redlining is. And I love how you spoke about this perception that above the Mason-Dixon line, things were just all kind of peachy for Black folks and white folks.
Right.
But redlining was really, really intensely practiced across the Midwest, East Coast, other parts of the country.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder if you could just give us a snapshot of what redlining is and how does it even impact us today?
Yeah. I think the most succinct definition I can give is that redlining is financial discrimination. There's a lot of different forms of redlining. Redlining could be that banks in specific areas and cities refuse to offer loans or credit lines or even just any services to residents of a specific community, often Black residents, but there's been redlining that has specifically affected indigenous or Asian American communities, depending on the part of the country that you're in. But yeah, redlining and the anti-Black redlining that often happened was in a lot of urban communities. So during the Great Migration, you have Black people fleeing the North, fleeing the South for the North and the West. And they're fleeing violence, but they're also saying there's going to be more economic opportunity where I'm going, and there's going to be a chance for me to have a life that wasn't possible in the Jim Crow South. And they get to these northern cities like Chicago and Detroit, and they're being redlined out of living in certain neighborhoods, redlined out of having certain access to financial services. And so they can't do the things that they want to do, like own property. So they become renters, and they are corralled into these ghettos, and they are trading these expansive farms in the South for these cramped apartments up north because it's the only thing that's being made available to them. The same thing is being told to Black people who are coming up north with enough money and want to own buildings and become landlords or open up businesses. They're not being given the opportunity to even vie for certain property in neighborhoods that they're just like, we refuse to offer land to these people. And sometimes this is informal. Sometimes, residents in an area just decide, don't sell your house to any Black person. Sometimes it's as explicit as being on HOA deed restrictions and mandates that property in this neighborhood will not be. It's explicitly in bank policies that they will not extend any credit or any loans or any grants of any sort. And so all of these things, but while they're continuing to give this to white America, it's just continuing to widen the racial wealth gap. And so, and that redlining that is often happening up north is also happening down south by the USDA. The USDA is also deciding we're not going to give out loans and grants to Black farmers and landowners who need it. That becomes the basis of this Supreme Court case in the late 90s. And that leads to this Pigford settlement is that the USDA was incredibly strategic in refusing to give loans and grants that were supposed to be going to all residents in a certain neighborhood, but refusing to give them to Black people, so that Black farmers are going bankrupt and being forced to sell or auction up the farms because they're being redlined out of the financial resources that are being made available to their white peers.
Oh, oh, okay, okay. I'm not gonna
Yeah.
hold you. This is feeling heavy.
I
This is
know it is. It is. We got to get to the positive stuff though, because I
yes.
think what I realized when I was writing this book was I had no idea what my elders were up against. And
Mhm.
it's easy when you grow up in a northern or coastal city to downplay and to and in reality like look down on your ancestors and your elders, to think I would have done more and I would have fought more. And what I had to really realize was we still don't fully understand what our elders across generations, because they like to skip history. They say, okay, there was slavery, and then Lincoln freed the slaves, and then Dr. King had a dream, and
Right.
then Barack Obama was made president. But in between that, we had grandparents and great grandparents who were sharecroppers, who were landowners, who were teachers, who were building Black schools on land that they bought because there were no schools in their counties for Black children that were going to be federally or locally funded. You had Black churches who were providing the only education for miles to Black people of all ages, teaching children and adults in the same schoolhouse how to read and write, and using that education to go on to HBCUs that only existed on land that they had fundraised and bought. Like, I think the resilience goes hand in hand with the oppression, because
Absolutely.
while white people were trying to take everything from us, it was only because they saw what we were doing with it. We were so powerful. We fed each other, we clothed each other, we housed each other. And that history is what I really fell in love with as I was writing the book, was that we loved each other and the land more than white people hated us. And if
Mm,
we can get back to that, we can fight for a reparations that is not, well, what can white people give us? But is like, what can we demand and fight for and make possible? Because that's what our ancestors and our elders did. And that's what we can and should be doing now. No more task force, no more commissions and committees. We know what we need, and it's time to get to the execution. So the love is what fuels the resistance to the
mm.
hatred.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for lifting that up, because now I do want to explore just the spectrum of resistance and reclamation tactics, everything from the most radical and most fringe to things that some folks may already be familiar with, to what may come in the future. Just starting in the past with some of the more kind of fringe and radical kind of reclamation efforts. I want to talk a bit about placemaking and maroonage. Um,
Yes.
yes. First up, just I'm curious, how do you even understand these terms, just placemaking and maroonage?
Yeah, well, in general, I think of placemaking as very similar to any pursuit of belonging. This
Ooh.
idea that you have to know who and where you come from to have a identity that is defined by you and not defined by others. And Black people have had a contentious history with placemaking because we come from such a rich tradition and from a continent that has so much, so many so much innovation, so much expertise, so much wisdom, so many stories, so many religions, so many languages.
Mm,
But that has been kept and been blocked from a lot of our awareness. And when you are disconnected from a place, that becomes easier for the disconnect to cement and for you to feel lost and just like this aimless wanderer. And
mm,
so that's when I really believe that a lot of our elders and ancestors decided we need a place of our own. We can't have a freedom that is decided by and defined by white people. Like we have to have a place where we can be Black and that be enough, and we not be trying to assimilate. And so Maroons were the first to do that in a really radical sense, to say, I'm not going to ask for permission. I'm not going to wait for you to emancipate me. And I'm going to emancipate myself. And that's what Maroonage is, this idea of emancipating yourself, not waiting for anyone else. And so, in a very literal sense, what that meant was fleeing, running away. Not always running, when we think of fugitive enslaved people, though, we often think of people who ran north. That's
mhm,
always the narrative, people who ran north. Number one, there were many who ran south to Mexico because they were closer to the south than they were to the north. But also, there were many who, like the Maroons, would just flee to swamps and say, I know this land better than you do. And I'm going to build with the local indigenous people, and we're going to cohabitate and build a society outside of the society. And so, long before the Civil War or any emancipation, there were Black people who had fled, who were never heard from again. It's not clear that they ever made it beyond the states that they had fled. If they were in North Carolina, they fled to swamps in North Carolina. They're huge, great dismal swamps, is what they're called. And there were so many maroon communities there, but white people were not familiar with the terrain. Were not bold enough to wade through the water, pun intended,
mhm.
and to find them and root them out. And so they were able to live there in harmony, and they grew food and lived in the swamps on the water for generations, had children there, had grandchildren there, and decided that they were going to have freedom on their terms. And there were so many of those sorts of maroon settlements from North Carolina on down to Florida that were able to find freedom in their time, in their lifetime.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
in addition to maroonage, though, I'm curious about some more, for lack of a better word, contemporary tactics, but even thinking outside of the time period when it may have occurred, what are
Yeah.
other ways our folks have struggled and fought and resisted to reclaim land? So, talked about placemaking and maroonage. What else should we lift up here?
Yeah, we've done so much. I am so glad that you're asking the question in this way because so often the narrative's like, what did white people do for us? Or what did the government do for us? And no, Lincoln did this, and which party should we owe ourselves to because they freed us? And it's like none of y'all actually cared about us. We just cared about us enough to make a big enough fuss. So we had the Nat Turners and the Harriet Tubmans who were either freeing themselves or others or forcing America's violence back onto itself in a way that was making slavery unprofitable anymore. That was
Mm,
saying we're losing our property, the enslaved people. Plantations are burning. Abolitionist rhetoric is on the rise. Colonies and empires are crumbling, and now we've realized that it's inevitable because Black people have made it inevitable. And so I just want us to know that like we resisted, or our ancestors really did resist. And then even during the Civil War, tens and hundreds of thousands of Black people fled plantations and descended upon training camps in places like Lexington, Kentucky, and said, I will fight for myself. I will
mm,
fight for my family. I won't leave it up to white men to believe that they're going to fight for my liberation. And so that was really, really powerful too. And then, of course, you get to this place where we're free in this, de jure way. But in reality, we're still dealing with Jim Crow. We're dealing with the fact that Union men who were supposed to be fighting for us actually hated us and didn't want to live and work alongside us. And what does it mean to find a way here? And again, that goes back to placemaking. And we continue to do that. We would build all Black settlements and fight for corners of Oklahoma, and just we fought and we resisted in so many different mediums. Sometimes that was through armed resistance, which was important. Sometimes that was through our words, which was important, and our art, which was important. And sometimes that was the biggest resistance was buying the land and fighting for each other with that land. Buying the land and saying, I'm going to make sure that Black people in my county know that if they fall on hard times, they can come to me. We don't have to know each other well or be blood related, but I'm going to be someone that other Black people can depend on. And that's what our experience was historically. We showed up for each other.
Yes, indeed. Yo, Brea, I just got to say, I really appreciate your energy and your enthusiasm for
Thank
this
you.
important topic. Yes, it just makes me wonder, though, in light of your text as well, what inspired you personally to even think about these questions of land and reclamation? Yeah, why does this resonate so well with you?
Yeah, it was very, very personal for me. I dedicated the book to my paternal grandparents, Alfred and Janelle, who are no longer on this earth, but I know are following and guiding me every step of the way. And they were both really the catalyst for my love of land. Because I grew up in New York, so I was a grandchild of the Great Migration. But they insisted, and my parents insisted upon a connection to the South. We'd go back to North Carolina several times a year. And I knew that my family still had land down south. And we'd spend family reunions there and funerals and just summers. We just go for whatever floated our boat. We'd pile in the car and go down south. So I always had an appreciation for the South, but it felt more distant. And I'll be honest, I think it was my wife who really brought me back and helped me appreciate the seeds that my grandparents had planted, because she grew up in Chicago, but she grew up in a family that really leaned into nature. They would fish all the time together. They would can together. They would go to farmers markets and grow things through aquaponics, and just like really leaned into this idea that there was such an abundance that the planet around us had to offer, and that we had to be responsible about that, and really treat the planet the way that we wanted to be treated. And so that idea was something that she really taught me. And there's a little anecdote I put in the introduction of the book, because her grandmother is from Kentucky. And so I would say often, I'd be like, Mama is what we call her. And I'm like, Mama, why do you think your kids love the land so much? And she said to me, she was like, because they never had any. And she was
Ooh,
being funny, but I thought it was so deep.
yeah.
Like, wow, to go back to placemaking, this idea that Black people who don't have access to land love it so hard in that absence. And we carve out the time to get to that land anytime we can, any chance we get. We want to bring our kids back to it and show that love to them.
Mm.
And that was something that really stuck with me. So that was the general journey, but that wasn't really me trying to write a book. That was just a personal journey. But my grandfather died in 2019, and I started doing even more of this history because I wanted to feel closer to him. And I started doing that history with my grandmother, asking her lots of questions, asking her if she would introduce me to people and sit with me as I interviewed them. And then me realizing this is worth more than just for our family. This is
Mm.
a story that I think a lot of Black Americans will relate to, and that a lot of non Black Americans should learn from, and learn that reparations is a necessity, not optional, not a if we got the money, if we could find it. No, we got to find it, because it is mandatory that we do right by those who worked this land and built the wealth that we all get to recline on now.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I was just going to ask, at what point did the connection to reparations begin to be made for you between this history of land theft and your own familiar history with land? Yeah, how did you even come to connect this to the notion of reparation? Was there a particular moment,
Yeah.
or was it always kind of circling? Yeah.
It was always there. I mean, I'd always grown up in a family that was very pro Black. Every February, we were watching the full Roots, like all of the DVDs, back to back to back, full Roots. We were constantly learning about Black history, the good, the bad, the in between. And reparations was always brought up, not really in a serious, it's going to happen way, but as this sort of broken promise way. Like, you're supposed to get 40 acres and a mule. So I'd always grown up knowing that we would do that, but it felt like they ain't never gonna do that for us sort of thing. And then when I was doing more of the digging and realizing within my own family, again, I had thought we were the success story, because my family still collectively across, many extended family members owns about 100+ acres of land in North Carolina. That feels monumental to me. And I feel really grateful to come from a family that has that story. But when I did the digging, we had 600 acres of land about 60 years ago.
Wow.
And so to me, I'm just like, where are the 500 acres that should have been ours, that should have grown, that we should have been able to sell and say, oh, everyone's going to college debt free because we have the assets to sell and put up as collateral or whatever that we need to do. And it's not there for us to do with it what we need. And so that was when I really realized, like, no, reparations is not just, even though it is also for the unpaid wages during slavery, which is centuries long unpaid wages. But there are recent, like within the last 100 years, harm that has compounded the harm of the unpaid wages. And we need reparations for that. Like, I want my check for the stolen wages of my ancestors and for the land that was taken in the last 60 years. And those instances are very concrete examples that you don't have to give me some find out how much money to give me.
Yeah.
The 500 acres, we can go to the Register of Deeds office right now and find out how much it's worth, who owns it, and you decide whether I'm going to get the acres back or I'm going to get the monetary value back. And Where's My Land, led by Kavan Ward, that's an organization, what they did with Justice for Bruce's Beach in California is really proving that we can get families their land back and we can get this direct restitution. It doesn't have to be this mythical. I mean, yes, also, I think every Black American should get some sort of restitution, but there are specific families who know we used to have land in Santa Monica. We used to have land in Alabama. We used to have land in Mississippi. This is where it was. And this is who has it now. And we can get that back.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned something, a bit of a small thread. I don't want to get lost in this conversation. I believe I heard you say often when reparations would come up in certain contexts, it's often talked about as like this kind of vague, ethereal idea, wishing upon a star type thing. Um, how do you think we can move away from that?
Yeah.
And also, I'm curious, what are some of the biggest just misconceptions around the notion of reparations? You kind of speak about this? Yes.
Yeah, this is a good point. I think reparations a lot of lore and legend has surrounded the idea of when it was first introduced and how it has evolved. But over time, I think a lot of Black Americans have just really attached on to this 40 acres and a mule promise. And that is something that has, at least for me, I think different generations might feel differently, but at least for me, I felt like I just grew up hearing about 40 acres and a mule, even if it wasn't from my family. Spike Lee, 40 acres and a mule, I always heard those sorts of references in a way that felt important to Black America, but also legend and not concrete, something that was going to happen. And I think a lot of the misconceptions are, number one, it's going to be too hard to prove who deserves reparations. And I think there's definitely some tensions now because we have a lot more mixed race communities and families than we did at a time when the one drop rule was law. But I still think that can't be an excuse because there is a group of people that we can start with. We can always scale it up and start with a small group of Black descendants of American slavery who can prove certain things and then get bigger and bigger and bigger and grow and grow and grow the way that we did with COVID-19 payments and all sorts of things. Not everyone got the support that they needed immediately, but we started with who we knew. Okay, we got to get support to the emergency responders first. And now we got to get support to those who have lost their jobs. Okay, now everyone needs a check. Okay, now we got to continue PPP loans, but only for a targeted group. We can figure it out for other situations, but suddenly for reparations, we get confused. Like, So to me, I was just like, all right, the idea that it's too confusing is weird. I think I won't say this is a misconception, but the idea that it's just, we can't afford it. Honestly, that's real. If America tried to pay true reparations, which would be the unpaid wages, the stolen land, and the interest compounded, it would bankrupt the nation. But all of the plans that have been put forward are deep discounts on the reparations that should be paid. And so the fact that they're avoiding that and saying that they can't afford it while giving billions to Israel or to Ukraine, or the Pentagon loses billions of dollars. We have no idea where's that going.
Yeah.
So to me, it's just like we get real penny pinchery when it comes to Black people getting their just due and our just due. But when the military needs something, or when a foreign nation needs something, suddenly money is growing on trees.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, there's always this, for lack of a better term, almost like a scarcity mindset uh, with regards to how to
Yeah.
reallocate resources. And it's just ridiculous. It just reminds me of what we were talking about earlier in terms of like the individualism that we carry with us and the way that we think about just resources, including land. Um, I do want to ask a bit of a small follow up on this as I'm thinking about like some Black folks, some of us who hold on to this almost neoliberal idea of what
Yeah.
could be, right?
Yeah.
You're not checking. We talked about Nimbyism a bit. So
Mm.
yeah, so NIMBY, NIMBY, not in my backyard for folks who are unfamiliar with the acronym. Um, what does that even mean? And how do you think that affects us today? I have two very specific examples. Thinking whether or not I'm gonna name drop them, probably will. But I'm just curious, Brea. How has NIMBYism kind of showed up in your work and your travels?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a few versions of this. I think there can be intra-community and extra-community. So you referring, because I think there's, as you said, not in my backyard isms. Like I think there can be this white and or wealthy, because I have seen Black wealthy people do it as well.
Yes.
But this white and or wealthy idea of, y'all can breathe the bad air, drink the bad water, but not over here. For
Mm,
example, what happened in Flint. You
mm,
find out that there are private companies that knew the water was bad and was bringing in their own clean water instead of saying, "Hey, let's sound the alarm and get clean water to everyone." Right? So that's the, okay, not over here for me, but over there for you is fine, and as long as it stays over there for you. But then sometimes it can happen in other instances too. So wait, so tell me more about how you want me to, like, which definition you want me to dig into.
Well, no, however you receive it, however you understand it,
Okay.
the way that I typically think about it, I'm gonna just go ahead and name drop them. You all can look up the articles. But Dave Chappelle and as well as Steph Curry were involved in a bit of the NIMBYistic tactics. Specifically with Dave Chappelle, they were going to build some affordable housing near some of his properties, and he advocated at City Hall to remove his businesses from that township if they were to do this. Steph Curry had a similar situation where they were proposing, I believe, don't may get this wrong. It was either a shelter and or a bit of affordable housing near one of his properties. And again, he advocated through city policies to have that shut down. They did not want that in their backyard. And,
Yeah.
not even trying to pick on like rich folks and celebrities. We see this at so many different socioeconomic levels. Just in my own experiences, when I lived in Philadelphia, there were fights to install safe injection sites in North Philadelphia,
Mm,
well as
yeah.
shelters for the young Black queer folks, shelters for victims of intimate partner violence. And it would always surprise me when folks from the community, folks from the neighborhood just did not want those spaces in their
Yeah.
communities, in their.
Because we have internalized the lies that white supremacy has told us. And so we believe certain things to be inherently bad the way they've told us that we are bad if we do it. And so we try to distance ourselves. And so that's why you can see it at a lot of different socioeconomic levels, because like, oh, I'm not like those Black people over there. And I'm
Mhm.
going to prove it to you by being so gung ho. It's like, I think it's an NWA song where one of them, Easy E or Ice Cube, one of them is like a Black cop showing out for the white cop. And this idea that what you don't want to do is be pulled over by a Black cop who has a white partner, because now he's going to show I'm not like this guy. So I'm going to go in on him to prove that I don't have an allegiance to him based on race.
Yeah.
And it's really sad because you should. And racial solidarity, specifically within Black people, is just, you should never be ashamed of that at ever and at any point. But especially in these instances where it's affecting people's housing, people's quality of food, people's quality of air, people's quality of water, it really concerns me. And again, as you said, it's a very neoliberal tactic to go private instead of getting more communal. Because the way that we have learned from our elders and our ancestors is, when you have more, you share more. When you have less, you continue to share, because you know what it's like to have less, and you continue to do that. But this idea that it's like, okay, like what's happening in California with wealthy people. This idea that as wildfires continue, more and more wealthy neighborhoods are getting their own private firefighting teams. So
Whoa.
certain communities are sort of just left to defunct firefighting agencies or to incarcerated firefighters. But like the Kim Kardashians and those of the world get the private firefighting teams. And it's not just the Kim Kardashians. There are a lot of Black celebrities who are getting these sort of privatized things too. And again, it's so short-sighted to think that you can save you or your family by going so inward. Because the reality is the more inward you go, the less you trust everyone around you, because
Mm.
you were taught to insulate yourself by thinking you're better than everyone else. So you learn to say, well, I can't have them near me because they're a danger to my family, but now I don't trust anyone. So I have to continue to go private and go private and go private, but we need each other. We're so interdependent upon each other. And we need what's happening to you, especially we learned this during COVID-19, the idea that I can be safe and healthy and my neighbors are not safe and healthy is not making sense, but that's what America tries to teach us and what we try to internalize and recreate and replicate, trying to be success on America's term, which is why I really reject the idea of Black billionaires, because you get to a certain level where the only way to stay a Black billionaire is to do the not in my backyard. Because I'm sure Dave Chappelle would get on a podcast like this and say, wait. That had nothing to do with anti-Blackness. I just knew that my investment was going to suffer, and that wasn't fair to me for my investment. But you're using this coded language to say, I don't want to tie my business to people who need affordable housing, even
Yeah.
though people who need affordable housing in cities like the one where I'm trying to sell my product or make money in are Black and brown. So I don't want to be associated with those Black and brown people in case they bring my business down or they make me less money. And you're okay with that. Instead of saying, I want to build this community up, even if I'm going to take a short-term hit, it's not about the money. I want people to be able to afford the products or the media that I create. And I want them to have a living wage. And they need to have affordable housing to do that.
Yes, indeed. Okay. I want to lift up somewhat of a big question, but I want to break it down through some very specific examples of some very specific tactics. Because what I'm hearing right now is this tension between this neoliberal mindset, this colonial
Yeah.
mindset that wants to individualize resources, wants to privatize resources, manufacture scarcity, and on the
Yeah.
flip side of that, this much more abundant mindset, this communal approach to thinking about land resources that we all share, all need to live. With that said, I'm just curious on a very high level, Brea, how do you understand stewardship of land versus the ownership of land?
Yeah. Yeah. I use the two terms interchangeably sometimes, like in the subtitle of the book, but there is a distinction in my opinion. And I use them because I don't think a lot of people associate themselves as a steward or with stewardship. But to me, ownership is really just, this is my asset that I'm supposed to make money from. So
Mhm.
I get a deed that says it's mine, or I pay a mortgage to a bank so that I could eventually get that deed that says it's mine, whatever the case may be. But the ownership is really around asserting to other human beings that this is mine and you need my permission to do anything with this land. You can't grow on it, you can't build on it without my permission. And I think that ownership is really important in the current day and age where we live, because you need to build and live and eat off of a piece of land. And you need a place, because right now it's not like you can grow food in a public park, though you should be able to. It's not like you can say, hey, this is a fruit tree in public and I should be able to use it. That could be trespassing. So in a world like that is so rigid and has these lines that say you can only be on what's yours, you need something, you need to own something. But I think what we should be working towards is stewardship. And stewardship is not just your agreement and your contract and your posturing for other human beings, but it's your commitment to the land itself, which is to say, I feel responsible for you, not just as an asset that's going to make me money to say I got to make money moves for you, but to say that I care about what happens to this land. So that's not just as soon as I get the land, I'm going to throw a building on it that's going to destroy it, or I'm going to grow things on it like around the clock in a way that strips it. But it's to say, hey, this land is exhausted and it needs a break. or I need to do crop rotation, or I can't be littering on it, or the water is really polluted and I need to fix that. The dam is broken and I need to fix that so that the animals have water and that there's an ecosystem here. It's to care about all of those things, not just in this altruistic sense, but also because it's a cycle. So the stewardship is honoring the cycle that says, I'm only here because the land is here. And if I don't treat the land as though I'm only here because of it, then my future generations will not be. And we're getting to a place where young people, especially Gen Z climate activists and indigenous climate activists and the Black climate activists, are really saying we are not going to have anything to pass on to our children. Not money. We're not going to have a planet to pass on to them if we don't take this seriously. And stewards have been saying that, though. Indigenous land stewards are responsible for most of the deforestation, most of the reforestation, forgive me, that happens as a result of the deforestation. So they're rebuilding the lungs of the planet, planting trees, and ensuring that we have a natural and generative and reciprocal relationship with the land, as opposed to, ooh, I heard I could make a lot of money off of cotton. So now I'm going to have huge plantations of just cotton. That's not what the land was ever intended to be. The land was supposed to have fruit trees, but also grass, but also plants that we don't eat, but other animals do eat, and also plants that just filter the air, and also plants that just help the soil. And if we don't have those native plants anymore, then we are stripping the land and we are making it so, and we feel those impacts because areas where the land is being treated in that way are getting hit with natural disasters much harder than they ever have before. Like that's true for my family's land in North Carolina. And it's not because of what we did, but we're in Northeast North Carolina and we used to have barrier islands and swamps. And we now have golf courses and resorts that have made it so that hurricanes are coming much further inland because land stewards are not there. It's developers and owners who are saying, well, it's mine, so I get to do with it what I want. And I say I want a golf course. But if you're looking at the terrain and saying, but a golf course isn't meant to be here.
Yeah.
And that's going to hurt the land and the people who depend on the land and the other animals that depend on the land. So I could talk about this all day, but
No,
I
ma'am,
didn't even set out to write a book like that at first, but it kept screaming out at me that was like, this is more than a book about money and reparations. It's also to get people to see that reparations is a climate justice policy, because until Black people and indigenous people get to be stewards again, the land is going to suffer.
My goodness, my goodness. No, I just have a small follow-up comment. As you were speaking about golf courses. So I just relocated from California back to my home in Louisiana.
Yeah.
California is gorgeous, but there are very intense droughts that take place
Yeah.
throughout the state. You mentioned the wildfires earlier that are a cause from those droughts.
Yeah.
Thinking about the golf courses, they get watered regularly, like nonstop out there in California. And I just think about like the oncoming, God forbid, but water wars, because
Yeah.
clean, fresh drinking water is becoming like more scarce. And golf courses absolutely kind of contribute to that scarcity.
Yeah.
Makes me think about again our relationship with land, not as a generative, reciprocal
Yeah.
relationship, but I'm thinking
Yeah.
about there's a text. Oh my. Decolonizing Visuality by Nicholas Mirzoff. Okay.
Ooh.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So he talks about like the birth of landscape, like painting and photography, and what that did to change people's relationship with land, as something to look at, not something to experience, something to dominate, right, and
Yeah.
cultivate. Really, just purely to kind of look at for pleasure, but not recognizing the spiritual power in that, not recognizing the life-giving power in that.
Yeah.
Yeah, all that just came up for me, especially as I'm in Louisiana. We're prepping for like one of the worst
Yep.
hurricane seasons.
Yep.
So yeah, this is hitting home. But I also don't want to lose sight of some of those very real, concrete reclamation tactics that are happening today. One that I think about that could potentially, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. One tactic that could potentially shift our mindset and our relationship with land from this notion of like just privatized ownership to one more of stewardship in a communal
Yeah.
sense. This notion of community land trust.
Yeah.
Curious how that lands with you. And I'm wondering if you could just speak a bit about what a community land trust is, what it may have to offer us in terms of shifting our relationships with land.
Yeah.
Are there any examples you can lift up around community land trust?
Yes, I love that you brought this up. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways that community land trust can happen. Um, the a nonprofit or a foundation can own a land trust, but basically, like a land trust in general is this idea of communally held land, and the trust is really just like the legal, agreement or framework that governs the land, which
Mhm.
says, some land trusts are specifically for conservationist efforts, which say the land is being held in this trust. It cannot be built upon. It is only here to just be land, you can't do anything to it. We just want to conserve some of this land as it is, right? Other land trusts are more, this is a land holding that is held by a group of people, which could be a family. Land trusts are very common in white families, and that's how you hold on to land and get to kind of avoid some of the like tax things that happen with inheritances, because people think it's enough to just have a will. But white America has learned, because they have designed, that a land trust is really how you preserve your land holdings, and you get to say that this land has to stay in the family. It cannot be sold to someone who's not in the family, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of different ways that land trust can happen, but it opens up a lot of possibilities because you have so much control over it. I've seen some really incredible community land trusts where they are Black owned farms, where it's just about teaching young people how to grow, how to farm, how to be in nature, how to camp, how to start a fire, just giving them these seminal experiences. So those are really beautiful. There are other land trusts, like I said, that are conservationists, but that work with Black and indigenous farmers. There's one in North Carolina, TLC, Triangle Land Conservancy. And so they buy land and then either give it or sell it for a significantly discounted price to Black and indigenous people so that they can be the stewards of that land. And I think their work is really incredible. They don't see it as a replacement for reparations, but I do think it's a really innovative way on the path to that. Is this idea of, you know, large nonprofits or white families who have large land holdings and are trying to be in this, hey, we want to take care of this land, are
Mhm.
recognizing that the best way to take care of this land is to give it to those who have always took care of the land, Black
Mhm.
and indigenous people. And I think that's a really beautiful practice. I've met so many Black farmers who have gotten land in that way and have really shown that when we have the access, we can do so much for ourselves and our communities. We just need the platform. It's like that meme. I had the plan, I just needed the platform.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Okay. I want to talk about another tactic. I'm curious how this lands with you, with just the notion of community gardens and food sovereignty. So, for our listeners and for those of us who are kind of based in more metropolitan areas, who may not have much green space around them, who may have, for whatever reason, lost familiar ties to the Great Migration in the South. I'm curious, what role might community gardens play in reclaiming our relationship with land?
Yeah.
Yeah, any thoughts
I
there?
love you framed it that way because I really do think that community gardens can be such a gateway or a stopover for those who don't have the land now, because
Mhm.
that's the reality for a lot of us, especially younger generations, where we're dealing with student loan debts and medical debts and inflation and all sorts of things. Sometimes you don't own land for yourself, but you can be part of a community garden. And again, so sometimes these are nonprofits that have land and decide that they're going to turn it into a community garden. And so there's so many urban community gardens like that where they grow food and try and give it out to the community and let people come and volunteer there. Sometimes these happen like in apartment buildings or things like that, where there's a garden available to that specific community. And I've seen it even at schools, like where it's like, oh, we have this garden for this specific group of people, whether that's a school community, a faith community, whatever. But we have this garden available. And if you want a plot, you can rent a plot or you can volunteer and do these sorts of things. So there's a lot of creative ways. For those of you who are hearing this and wondering if there's one near you, search in any of those formats. If you are someone who's a student, if you're someone who's a teacher, if you're someone who just lives in a larger city, just Google community garden near me, community garden at insert university or at insert campus. And there's a lot of different paths. And I think it can be really beautiful for people to get their feet and their hands a little wet and a little dirty on something that feels a little low stakes and to also get the communal experience from it. Because there's some people who can just go in a zone and be in a garden by themselves and that be their world. There are other people who it's like, I need someone to tell me, how do I get this off of the branch? Do I just pick it? Do I cut it? How do I know what this is versus this is? Is this healthy? Does it need more water? And you can learn that with each other and in this community garden. And I think it teaches people who are not otherwise given a lot of space to take pride in their community. Because the reality is you get desensitized from your space when you don't own it. So it's easier to say, well, I don't care if people are trashing this neighborhood. I don't own it. But when you're like, no, this is my neighborhood. My family has lived here for generations. I grow fruit in that community garden. Don't mess up this place. It's beautiful and it's something that I've put my hard work into. And you take so much pride and joy in it being preserved in that way. But I also think once that seed is figuratively and literally planted in you, and when you really realize like, wait, I can grow some strawberries, I can grow some tomatoes. And if that's what I can do in this little garden bed of this community garden, imagine what I could do in my backyard. Imagine what I could do with an acre. Imagine what I could do with 5 acres. And I think there's so many young people who have realized that they didn't think they were interested in the outdoors or in nature or in agriculture. But once they actually tried it, it was so fulfilling and so rewarding. And they wanted more. And it became this sort of insatiable hunger to say, I actually deserve more than this little plot. So I think community gardens can be a nice way to ease us into the more expansive acreage that we all deserve.
Absolutely, absolutely. One thing that comes up for me, okay, I'm trying to debate how personal I may get with this particular history. So I used to be an organizer around
Mm.
housing and labor specifically, and there was one particular issue that came up, particularly around the pitfalls when considering community renovation versus true revitalization.
Uh-huh.
And there was this term that would float around back then, this notion of art washing. It's related to
Yeah.
vacation. In short, it really just means plopping some sort of a community amenity in a divested neighborhood, claiming that it's going to renovate and revitalize the space, but it just
Yeah.
ends up affecting the actual kind of housing market and rental market,
Yeah.
and pricing. Yeah, though folks who are at risk of being unhoused out. I'm curious, how do you navigate this tension between like true community revitalization versus just the aesthetic kind of renovation? Has this
Yeah.
come up in your travels at all? Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's a big part of my story because I grew up in New York and I don't live there anymore. And part of that was because I just didn't see homeownership as feasible for me there.
Mhm.
I think I got to a place where I was just like, I think I'm gonna have to save for a very long time to be able to afford even a box in a place that I grew up in. And that's the difference between revitalization versus gentrification.
Mhm.
Because if they were revitalizing the neighborhood, they wouldn't need to push people who were already there out. And that's also where ownership comes in because it feels confusing. Like, why do things get so expensive randomly? A Starbucks shows up on a corner, a Whole Foods shows up on a corner, and all of a sudden, no Black people live there anymore. But why don't Black people get to have a Starbucks and a Whole Foods? Why does that have to be a sign of white people coming in? And what
Mhm.
you realize is that it's the reality is that the Black people didn't own their homes. So the people who owned their homes were white and said, oh, now that there's a Starbucks and a Whole Foods here, I can start charging this much in the rent. And that is pricing people out and saying that the only people who can come back are people who can afford it. And if the people who can afford it are young white students and interns and graduates and new families who are willing to get a fixer upper in a transitioning neighborhood and then transform it and make it the new Soho, then
Mhm.
that becomes the reality. And so when you own the block though, then you could say, yeah, let's get a coffee shop on the block and let's get a grocery store on the block, but the rent stays the same. And that's where we need people like the Dave Chappelles and the Steph Currys and the whoever else is to be willing to say, I don't need to make the maximum return on this investment if
Yeah.
it means that people can afford to live, work, and play in the same neighborhood. Not I live here because it's cheap, but I have to commute 2 hours into another neighborhood to serve the people who live there because that's where I can find a job. But no, I get to live, work, and play here because the community has made that affordable. I can find groceries in my neighborhood. I'm not in a food desert or the food apartheid system, but that there are things near me, and that those things being near me don't magically make my neighborhood too expensive for me to live
My goodness, my goodness. Right now, I'm thinking about, some of us, um, for many of the reasons you've already outlined, may be really feeling the brunt of the current housing crisis.
in. Yeah.
Um, a couple of years ago, I want to say in maybe 2018, 2019, there was this wonderful text. I won't say wonderful, but it was a very necessary text. But it was titled "Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City."
So good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
ain't it right? And I believe I
Yeah.
can't get
So
the
good.
exact numbers right. Producers, we're gonna do this in the edit and post, but I believe at this time the rate of evictions in this country were like one every 90 seconds.
Wow.
It was very, very intense. But even with that being shared, that startling fact, I was always impressed by folks who were leading work to kind of reclaim just housing, just in and of
Yeah.
itself, not even thinking about just being able to purchase land, whether through CLT or other means, but thinking about groups like Moms for Housing. um
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, what do you think about Moms for Housing and some of those reclamation tactics?
No, I think these groups are so important because, again, Isabel Wilkerson said something really powerful about geography not really changing much for Black Americans in this country. I think that's important for us to reconcile. Like, there needs to be reclamation in a rural sense and a suburban sense and an urban sense. Like,
Mm,
we need to reclaim public space and private space, in all of these different spaces, because there are Black people in cities, there are Black people in suburbs, and we're in rural areas too. So we need it all, and I think affordable housing, and not just affordable, but affordable, clean, and safe housing is what I love that Moms for Housing talks about. Is not just can I afford this, but is it a place where I should be raising children? Is
mm,
this a place where children are not being exposed to toxins and violence, and where I can get them food that is good for them? Or is this a neighborhood where there's only delis and fast food and liquor stores, and where my children are walking to school or taking public transportation to school through through areas where they happen to navigate a lot of violence? And so
mm,
Moms for Housing is really important, in digging into that. And I think we just have to make sure that we reconcile, like, there are lots of different things that cause unsafety, and violence. And we need to make sure that we are not deeming Black neighborhoods as unsafe for housing, but that the conditions that are forced upon us are creating unsafety in neighborhoods where Black people want to be safe too. Like, it's
mm,
not like Black people are like, "Yeah, if you come here, you better opt into that." Like, no, we want better. But if you're going to force us into these tight corners with depravity and precarity and no disposable income, then people are going to have to learn, I got to look out for me and watch over my back, and you got to look out for you and watch over your back. And I can't afford to be doing that for you and for me. I got to be looking out for my family. That might mean that one day your family has to get got, if it means that my family eats and lives another day. That is a crabs in a barrel mindset, but the crabs were not supposed to be in the barrel. So let's get the crabs back in the sea, and then we can all be happy with Ariel and everything, like, but we can't do that in the barrel. So we got to dismantle the barrel so that we can then find the full housing, and there should be enough for all of us. And you said something earlier about scarcity mindset. Like, we got to get back to the abundance.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. Quick question related here. Do you think there's any tension between demands for, let's say, universal housing versus calls for like more private Black home ownership? Do you think there's any tension between those?
No, I don't, because I think that reparations and Black demands have to come first. And then I think that will help people realize how much abundance exists in this nation. I think we don't really know how many acres we have available. So when Black people talk about needing reparations, and then indigenous people talk about land back, white people jump to, "You're going to kick me out of my house." And it's like, well, I mean, a hit dog on a holler. Do you need to be kicked out of your house? Did you take it from someone? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
like, tell the truth that that's what happened, but that's not where we need to start. There's plenty to go around. The problem is that colonizers came in and said there's only enough for us and only for you to work it. But there was always enough to go around. There was always enough. And so when we disrupt the scarcity mindset and come back to the abundance that says there's enough for, let's start with Black and indigenous people. Let them get what they need. And then we realized we still got some more to go around. We can make affordable housing the norm. That also means that we got to make rural and suburban areas more exciting places for people to live and work. Because
Mm,
right now, people are confined in cities where they think that's their only employment opportunities. But if
yeah.
people realize, like, I can hold down a job and have a lot of green around me, I don't need to live on top of people. I'd love that. But people can't move to a place where they don't know they'll have work and income. So when we set up this infrastructure all over the country, you realize affordable housing is a lot easier and cheaper than they're making it seem,
Gee, okay,
and create
okay,
a lot of jobs.
okay. All right. I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to get personal. Give me like 2 minutes.
No, do it, do it.
Yo, okay. So right now, I'm heavily holding on to this notion of stewardship,
Yeah,
and also this idea of reimagining space. But I
yeah,
want to hopefully these two anecdotes makes this concrete for folks. So we talked about Moms for Housing, and actually the group I was a part of, the Black and Brown Workers Cooperative in Philadelphia, was deeply inspired by the actions of Moms for Housing. So
mm,
elder Black women came together to reclaim these empty, vacant homes, right? And then they announced this as a provocation, saying like, "Hey, there's all this vacant space that's habitable, that's just being held for speculators, right?
yeah,
What would happen if we were able to turn this over?" Well, in Philadelphia, we were deeply, deeply kind of catalyzed by that way of thinking. And there were two actions that I just want to kind of talk through here. One was this notion of the Department of Space and Land Reclamation. Have you ever heard
yeah.
of it?
I have a little bit. Yeah,
Yes, yes. So for some of us who may be unaware, the Department of Space and Land Reclamation was really an ad hoc collective of artists, organizers, and Black folks at risk of displacement, which came together actually in 2001, April of 2001. I believe it was like Earth Day weekend in Chicago.
yeah.
And they just leveraged all these kind of radical tactics, everything from guerrilla gardening to setting up like these kind of fake meetings with housing speculators with
Mm,
at risk of displacement in those neighborhoods where the
wow.
speculators would come in and think that they were going to get a tour of a home or a space, but what they were actually engaging was Black folks telling them, hey, actually, this is how this is impacting us, right?
Mm,
So came across this story, and in the context of Philadelphia in 2018, the Black and Brown Workers Cooperative was very much interested in combating gentrification in West Philadelphia. At the time,
mm,
there was this policy called councilmanic prerogative. So the council person in that particular district had authority to sell off parcels of land to private developers, just as you mentioned earlier.
mm.
And we just felt it was ridiculous that those who are most impacted by these political decisions have no say in them whatsoever,
Yep,
you know?
yep.
So we literally went door to door. We just asked folks like, "Hey, what would you like to see in this space, in this
Yeah.
community? What would you like to see revitalized?" And everyone pointed to this one particular park. Was titled Squirrel Hills Falls on the corner of 48th and Chester in West Philadelphia. And apparently, Brea, in 1996, there was this one white artist who moved to West Philadelphia, raised private funds saying that she wanted to create a park for the community.
Mm,
It was open for one summer in 1996, and then she had stewardship over it, but closed it from 1996 to 2018.
huh?
1996 to 2018. Now, mind you, they had state of the art technology built into this park in 1996. They could have plugged in a projector, they could have had all these events, amazing things, right? Closed it down. So we're knocking door to door, and the community of all ages, they're telling us, like, actually, we kind of want to see something happen with this park. We're like, okay, well, we thought through the lens of the Department of Space and Land Reclamation, and um, a few of us donned these Tyvek suits and got a logo made as if this was a official community organization or government organization
Yeah.
sanctioned by the community, and we liberated the park, opened the park, named it People's Park. But what was so just heartwarming about that experience was the stewardship that the community felt over
Mm,
after it was open. Particularly once it was open, other community members created their own signs for the park. They had ad hoc puppet shows, music shows, religious
mm.
ceremonies. Unhoused folks were able to
Wow.
create like a bit of a small encampment for themselves there. And just through this artistic provocation, the community felt this sense of stewardship over this public space. We're like, oh my God,
this just for myself changed my relationship with how I think about land, right? So
Yeah.
in that, and just what other incident that kind of snowballed from this. Fast forward
Mhm.
from 2018 to 2020, advent of the pandemic, we realized like unhoused folks are deeply vulnerable to
Yeah.
pandemic, right? So what can we do? Well, we learned at the time that the city of Philadelphia owned large swaths. I'm talking about damn near hundreds of vacant
Ooh.
homes that they were just holding through their land bank. Well,
Mhm.
our group, the Black and Brown Workers Cooperative, as well as a constellation of other organizations through the banner of Philadelphia Housing Action, decided that, well, maybe the transfer of vacant city-owned property to community land trusts would be better for us all. Uh,
Mhm.
so during this
Yep.
time, we started to kind of enter into some of these spaces, reconnecting the water and electricity and moving unhoused folks in there. And then once it became to a point of critical mass, then we wanted to negotiate with the city to actually formally hand that stuff over into a community land trust.
Mhm.
I just mentioned all this because I really want us to think just outside of the box when we think about
Yeah.
reimagining space, what something could be, whether it's a vacant lot, vacant space.
Yep.
I'm curious, with all that said, though, Brea, how do you even understand this notion of reimagining space? How does this show up in your own practice?
First of all, thank you for sharing those two anecdotes. And I love the work that you were part of. So thank you also for that. Because I think it starts with imagination and it starts with people saying, like, people, as you said, when you canvassed them, it was top of mind for them. We want something done with the park. And all it took was a group of people being like, okay, let's open the park. And look how the community responds to and affirms and uplifts that. I think that is it shows what is possible when people, because I think for a lot of people they were like, wait, you could do that? You could just we could like then we could have just done that at any point since 1996, you telling me? Is we could have just done this? And I think that's important for people to see. Yes, there are certain things that we need to, do a petition and go on a march and tell Congress to pass or tell the president to do an executive order on or make sure you appoint the right people. But there's also a lot that's within our control if we just decide this is ours. Like this is literally ours. And what would we do if we were acting like it was ours? If we
Mhm.
were acting like we knew. And I think that the reclamation and the imagination go so hand in hand because then you open up the box and you say, well, what does this community need? And that might be very different from what another community needs. This
Mhm.
community might say, we want this to be a true garden. Another community might say, we need housing on one level, we need shops on another level, we need offices on another level, whatever. I've seen so many really cool, as you said with Moms for Housing, really cool. Hey, let's take this building and say, what can we use this building for? And if it's a single home building, let's get creative. If it's a multi-unit building, how can we make this a space that multiple community members get to be a part of and feel seen and heard through, and have that be a conversation, not a hey, we did this for y'all, but didn't give you a chance to be part of it. But you started by asking people and listening. And that's so important. Because then when you listen, you say, wait, people want to do something with the park. All we got to do is help them see what is possible with the park. And that's what y'all did by opening it. And I think more often than not, we don't have to have the whole picture figured out the way we think. We don't have to have this full business plan and whatever.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's just, let's just meet this urgency and meet this moment where it's at. Let's open the park, let's start the garden, let's whatever. You know there's there's someone in LA who calls himself an OG, the original gardener.
Oh,
And he does guerrilla gardening as well in LA. There's so many people who are getting creative about that, and I think with him he started by saying, hey, we got these dividers and the highways that have grass, and why are we growing things on the grass, and why am I being petitioned and fined because I'm choosing to use that space in a meaningful way? Y'all should be thanking me for doing this service for the community. And he started a larger conversation. So I think there's a lot of ways. And I think I don't even want to limit people by trying to list off too much because I want people to really, the world, like the possibilities are endless. And whatever we think, hey, my community needs more vegetables. Like I'm gonna turn this space into some more vegetables. My community needs a library, or my community needs something for kids to do. We gonna take this abandoned building and turn it into a place where they could have studio space, but they can also have somewhere where they can throw events. But there's also a space for them to hold teachings and classes. And then on the rooftop, there's gonna be a garden. Like whatever the space allows, but there's so much that we can do to say my community deserves more And instead of building another car dealership or another high rise or another McDonald's, like, let's build something that we need and want and are excited by, that people are like, this is gorgeous. Whether it's a mural, a small garden, a painted sidewalk, whatever. But there's a lot of ways to reclaim space and remind new residents and old residents that there are Black people here and that those Black people here have something to say.
My goodness, my goodness. Okay, we could be here all day.
I know, I know, I know,
Amazing.
I know.
Okay, I'm gonna try to. Okay, let me just try to whittle this last question down into something that's a bit digestible. Because I'm feeling like a very infectious energy right now. Thank you so much, Brea, for
No, thank
sharing your
you.
knowledge.
It's all you as a moderator. Like, you're such a great cultivator of space. So thank you for inviting me in and making this such a beautiful combo.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. For those of us who may be listening that feels super motivated, they want to go out and reclaim something right now. I want to know, from your perspective, Brea, what are just some practical, actionable ways that we can advance land reparations back?
Yeah.
Hey, how do we get plugged in? How do we get involved?
Absolutely. I'm gonna try and go in order from easiest to most challenging. Easiest one is to support the work of people like Where's My Land and Black Farmers Fund. Where's My Land is doing more direct service and support in the form of like legal and advocacy, running campaigns for Black families who have proof that their land was taken from them, no matter how long ago that was, and helping them get their land back. Again, this is the organization behind the successful Bruce's Beach campaign. And so they have so many more dozens of campaign in states like Ohio, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas. So those who are like, hey, I'm just interested in championing this nationally, any way that you support their work, a follow, a recurring donation, sharing their work, signing the active petitions that they have going on is going to help those families immensely. Same with Black Farmers Fund. For those who are interested in doing bigger donations, they give money in larger bulks to farmers to save their farms and to be able to really expand them and make them profitable. So those are organizations that I would say are really worth investing into. The second thing that I would say, if you're willing to do a little bit more work, is that Where's My Land might not have an active campaign in your county or your city, but there is an instance of land theft in your county and in your city. Do a little bit of digging. I promise you, a little bit of Googling will help you realize that. Even if you want to start broader with just like, generally, what part of my state do I live in? And let me see, Northeastern Ohio, has anything like that happened near me? And is there a way that I can support them to this day? Because that's what happened with Bruce's Beach. Kavan Ward was a California resident who just said, why is California talking about solidarity with George Floyd and they haven't given restitution to the Black families that they have disenfranchised? Let's talk about that. If you really are about this racial justice that you're talking about, this was 2020. If you're really about that, then put your money where your mouth is. And she built a campaign enough to say there's a family that needs land back in our backyard. So again, if we want to flip not in my backyard, are we going to have this oppression continue? So let's get serious about that. That's number 2, is find those instances in your hometown and be in solidarity, even if there's not a big media presence, because you can have a huge impact by calling people when you are an actual constituent. And then the last thing is having deeper conversations with family members, especially, I mean, I'm imagining that most people listening are going to be Black. So talk to your elders, talk to your ancestors, see if there's something for you to reclaim more directly. You know, if there's a story, if you're like, well, I think we used to own land, find out more about where. Find out more about what that was like, how long ago, what county, what part of the state. You'd be surprised what your elders know and just didn't think there was anything to do about. But the more that we hold on to these stories, the better. But to any non-Black people watching and listening to this, I mean, white people especially need to be having conversations with your loved ones and figuring out what you have inherited unjustly, what your parents have inherited unjustly, and how you can make amends. If you are a student or an educator at a university that has an endowment of any kind, like how Yale, where I went to school, has a $45 billion endowment, you need to be a part of some of that divestment and reinvestment campaign work. So these are conversations you can be a part of. Again, but that's about digging deeper into your family and your community institutions and being willing to find a story that doesn't fit the picture perfect idea that you had of yourself or of your family. And being willing to say, if my family or my ancestors did something that I don't agree with, I'm going to be a traitor to that. I'm going to be someone who says I'm going to make things right for the future generations. And you have to do that by being willing to find the truth first and foremost.
My goodness. My goodness. There are a lot of ways for all of us to play our part. Thank you so much for laying it out, Brea. Before we go, do you have any final words for us here?
Just so grateful for y'all. I mean, Black media matters so much. As a writer, coming onto a podcast like this is a dream. But I know that the work that y'all do is not possible without support. So I just hope that people continue to support y'all, show up for y'all, because as they're attacking books, as they're attacking curriculum, as they're attacking leaders, they're also attacking platforms like these. I know that y'all work so tirelessly to make this kind of content so real for listeners. So I just hope that people listening continue to support it so that authors like me have somewhere to go and talk about books like this. And then Rooted is out everywhere right now. You can get it on Bookshop. You can get it on Target, Walmart, Amazon, wherever you go for books, you can get it there. And please, 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 though, support a Black-owned bookstore.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Brea Baker, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
At PushBlack, we agree with Marcus Garvey when he said, a people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. We believe telling empowering stories on Black life and history can build a more liberated Black future. Being here with us lets us know you probably feel like that's important too. You matter. Your choice to be here matters. It lets us know that you value this work, and you make PushBlack happen with your contributions at blackhistoryyear.com. Most people do $5 or $10 a month, but everything makes a difference. Thank you for supporting the work.